Welcome back to Italian Military Archives and to another quarterdeck episode where I answer almost all your questions about the Italian Navy in World War II. So let's move on. And how does it work? So I will answer your questions that came through the Q&A posts that I posted on the channel community. And then after I answer these questions, today we have around 11 questions. I will reserve some time for a live Q&A segment where I'll try to answer live your questions. If you remember, a few weeks ago, I did the first quarterdeck Q&A live, so I also encourage you to catch up and watch that video. So before start, I remember to you that you can support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and for those of you who want to make a step further, there's the membership available. You can join, and there's the link in the description below. And you know the channel membership works as many other channels on YouTube. You have loyalty badges, custom emoji, priority answer to comments, and so on, and preview of new videos. There will be a new video coming out. Last week I published the video about the Italian submarine missions to Singapore in the Second World War. There will be a new one coming to the end of the month, early November, let's say. So you will be able to see it in preview. All the information are at the link below. And then, of course, there is also the Super Thanks button that you can use for donations. Anyway, coming to your questions, let's start with the first one. So a user asked, I know that the Gabbiano class corvettes came out a bit too late to have an impact on the war against the Allies, but I would like to find out more about their activity before and after the armistice. Okay, so I will try to answer in a summarized way all the questions, otherwise this will keep us for a very long time here, but I will do my best. So the Gabbiano class corvettes were an escort class of ships. They were corvettes. The Regia Marina decided for the construction of these corvettes in 1941 as the war dragged on, and especially the losses in terms of torpedo boats, destroyers were mounting, and so they need to protect the Axis convoys bound for North Africa were increasing, and so there was the need to provide new escort vessels and in the quickest way possible. So before the Gabbiano class corvette, there was a series of torpedo boats with focus on escort duties, the Ciclone class. And then this came later. They were ordered in 1941, as I said, and their construction started in early 1942 for most of them. 60 of them were ordered, so quite a big batch of ships, and 29 were launched by the armistice of September 1943. So around 18 of them managed to see service during the later stage of the Battle of the Convoys. So that means the very few weeks of the Egyptian and Libyan campaign and the full brunt of the Tunisian campaign. These were meant to be expendable vessels because they used a lower value steel. And it was thought they could have lasted for 6, maximum 10 months, but they will survive much more than that. We will see in a while. These vessels were also quite easy to build. Depending on the shipyard, they took different timing, but the quickest to be built were put together in the space of 7 to 9 months. So very, very fast for the standards of the Italian shipbuilding industry. They were focused on anti-submarine warfare. They introduced a feature of having the diesel engine, but also an electric engine for running silently and hunt down enemy submarines. They had, of course, depth charges, and they also had sonars. I mean, mostly Italian and German built sonars, and so they were and also hydrophones, if I remember correctly, on some of them. But they proved to be very, very good as escort vessels for the duties they were supposed to carry out. I mentioned here three submarines that were sunk specifically by this class of corvettes, and they fought hard in the later stage of the Battle of the Convoys. The Germans captured around 5 or 6 of them at the time of the armistice, and they put them together. They put them in service in the Kriegsmarine. The Germans managed to put together a wide array of light ships in the Mediterranean after the armistice. Former French, former Italian, some former Yugoslav ships, former Greek ships, and managed to carry out their escort duties for the coastal convoys, mine laying operation, and sea denial operations in the coastal areas, and so on. Interestingly enough, around 19 of them survived the war, and they served in the post-war Italian Navy until the 70s. And one, the Ape, served until 1981. It was reserved to training duties and other activities, but it served until 1981. So at the time after the Falklands War, there was still one Gabbiano class corvette in service in the Italian Navy. So a very interesting class that at some point will deserve an own video here on the channel. So let's move on. Another interesting question: was it wise to rebuild both the Cavour and Duilio class battleships instead of increasing the number of Littorios? Was it purely financial? So the Littorio class battleships were quite costly for the Italian standards. Bear in mind, and this will come later also in the live show, Italy was among the great powers of World War II, but it was also the least of the great powers. It was poorer and less developed than many other nations, and so this had many implications in the war effort, in the capability of the industries to catch up with the war effort, and so on. Coming to the Littorios, we know 2 Littorios were laid down in 1934. 2 more were laid down in 1938, and this was really a huge effort for the country. The first 2, Cavour and Cesare, who were all dreadnoughts from the World War I, the decision to rebuild them came as a response to the laying down of the Dunkirk class battleships, and later the Strasbourg. But this was meant to be a stopgap solution in order to have a decent remodernized battleship in service in a reasonable short time and at a reasonable low cost. Then came the 2 Littorios, and then in 1937 the decision to rebuild also the Duilios. I mean, in some sources you find not a definitive answer of why this was made. Somebody can argue that the materials and the workforce could be redirected to complete the Roma and the Impero. The Roma entered service in 1942, while the Impero never saw service because it was never completed. But at the same time, it can make sense to argue that it was a wise choice, because in the space of 3-4 years, and to a lower cost, there were some estimates that the cost of rebuilding a Duilio was less than half of one single Littorio, around 320 million versus 800 millions, adjusted to the inflation, but it's a very raw calculus. Anyway, this was a way for Italy to deploy a much more numerous battle fleet with a component based on older dreadnoughts modernized and a component of new fast battleships. I mean, yes, these battleships couldn't stand a direct confrontation with ships like the Queen Elizabeth, for instance. But at the same time, having these battleships meant that the enemy had to deploy battleships against them that were not in huge supply, also for the British with their worldwide commitments. So it can be said that this built up a decent deterrent for the Italians, although they were not the top level of the battleships around the world. So it can be argued that it was not a wise idea, but it also could be argued that it built up a decent deterrent for the Reggio Marina in the Second World War. And they also saw service in the escort duties during the Battle of the Convoys. But it's also true that at some point they were kept in port because of the scarcity of the fuel available, and the fuel was reserved to the two Littorio class battleships later on in the war. So another interesting one: how does Italy mast boats doctrine and usage compare to other nations' use of small attack boats in the Mediterranean? Did Italian small surface attack craft achieve more or less success than comparable vessels fielded by other navies during World War II, and why? So very complicated question, but in a nutshell, the mast boats were born during the Great War, especially the famous sinking of the Austro-Hungarian battleship Szent István at the hands of one of these small craft. The Italian Navy kept in service a decent number of these World War I era craft until the 1920s, early 30s. In 1934, this idea was revived with the construction of a new series of very fast mast boats. And this came at the same time of the crisis during the Abyssinian crisis. So, the decision of Mussolini to invade Ethiopia, and then this created frictions with the British Empire. Until then, Italy had quite decent relations with the British. The only future opponent was considered to be France. From the Ethiopian crisis, things started to change, and the Italian planners, especially naval planners, started to seriously think about a scenario where Italy had to face either Great Britain or Great Britain and France together. So the idea of having a decent number of small expendable vessels that could threaten major Allied ships in the coastal waters of Italy was quite appealing. There was also the attempt to build a series of motor torpedo boats, like the German Schnellboot or the PT boats. But the Italian industry had some problems in fielding a decent diesel engine that was capable of reaching the high speeds. So this was an attempt done with the it was called Moto Torpediniera Tour, but this proved to be a failure, and then the industry and then the Navy turned back to the mast boat idea. They came up with the 500 class. 75 crafts were built, and this was coastal units that could be employed efficiently in night attacks. In daylight, it's obvious that these were targets for enemy destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. The idea to employ them was as following: the mast boats were to be put under the authority of the maritime commands, like the maritime commands of Sicily, the maritime command of Sardinia, of the lower Adriatic, and so on. Each command had at their disposal a certain number of mast boats. And a certain number of these boats were also to be employed as part of the blockading force of the Sicilian Channel, together with the Spica class torpedo boats. One important thing to remember is that these boats were quite, they didn't have good seaworthiness. I mean, they could be used in coastal waters, but in rough seas, this could really not be used. And for most of the time of the year, they could hardly be used in the Sicilian Channel, given the currents and the marine conditions that take place in this strait. Their actions during the war were strictly limited by the meteo conditions, so their effectiveness was decreased by this. If it can be said that if Italy had developed earlier the concept of the motor torpedo boats, which later came with the copying the German design of the S boat, this would have been much more useful in the Sicilian Channel. In addition, they were dispersed, and it was quite hard to concentrate a huge number of them in the Sicilian Channel, where they were mostly needed. They were dispersed, as I said, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Ionian Sea, in the Adriatic, in the Aegean, and only in the later part of the war, some degree of concentration was achieved in the Sicilian waters, but never enough. And as I said, if the MTB's concept or the S-boat concept could have been developed earlier, it would have helped a lot to the Italian Navy to seal much more efficiently the Sicilian Channel to the Allied traffic, of course, bound to Malta. One thing I would like to mention, it's not certain because it's debated, but the Soviet cruiser Molotov that operated in the Black Sea was hit by a torpedo during 1942, and it was crippled for almost the remaining part of the war. It's debated whether this torpedo came from a mass boat deployed there, because for those who don't know it, yes, the Italian Navy operated in the Black Sea during the Second World War, and perhaps this will be also the subject of a future video. It's debated if it was a mass boat torpedo or a German torpedo bomber delivered weapon. An interesting thing that could be covered in this future video on the Italian Navy in the Black Sea. Okay, this is a long and hard question to answer. So I've always wanted to know the Regia Marina rangefinder development and capabilities, given it's always said they are one of the most capable during the war. Also, is there any other factors besides inconsistent ammunition that get fixed quite early in the war that contributed to the Italian disappointing gunnery, despite having one of the most capable rangefinders out there? Okay, the second part, it's trickier than that, but let's go step by step. So the Italians started to use British-built equipment for the first part of the 20th century, especially, the Barents Stroud British devices. Later, after the Great War, they acquired some German-built equipment, the Zeiss-built equipment, and the Germans prefer the stereoscopic rangefinders. The British prefer the coincidence rangefinders. I don't want to dig deeper into the distinction and the pros and cons of these two systems. There is a great video from Drachinifel about this. I recommend that to you. Can just remember that they achieve the same goal through different principles. The Italians, based on this British and German equipment, built their own devices that started to enter service in 1928, built by two companies, Officine Galileo and San Giorgio. These were the two companies that developed the rangefinders. And then they introduced in 1937 the duplex system. So the duplex system is a rangefinder that combines both a stereoscopic and a coincidence rangefinder. They have, as I said, pros and cons. If you have a ship equipped with both rangefinders, you can say that you have higher flexibility, that you can adjust better to certain situations where one can prevail over the other. In this picture of this is the Vittorio Veneto, you can clearly see that the Italian ships had an abundance of rangefinders. There was a duplex system in each of the main gun turret, the 15-inch gun turrets. These were the 12 meters long rangefinders, while a duplex system 7.2 meters long was put up in the conning tower, and a stereoscopic system of the same size was just below the previous one. Then, of course, there were those for the secondary armament, for the AA armament, and also I think another one on the aft mast. So an abundance absolutely of rangefinders, that can be said that this allowed the Italians to almost immediately get the accurate range on their targets. Okay, now getting to the second part of the question, for sure you have heard the story of how the Italian gunnery was poor, especially with reference to the dispersion of the salvos during the engagements in World War II. So I talked about this in the past, also in the part 2 video on the Littorio class, also in the episode where I was hosted by Drachinifel. But the long story short is that the dispersion thing is partly a myth. And why it is partly a myth? Yes, there was dispersion. Also, if you look at the gunnery tables, the Italian guns displayed higher dispersion than their British, the other British guns, like the 15-inch or the 356 millimeters of the King George V. Based on that, the Italians had a higher dispersion. It was a problem that was observed also before the war, especially in gunnery trials. But this was something that was observed in many of the other major navies. The thing is with the Littorios, it's also that the range at which they opened fire in the 4 occasions they opened fire during World War II, so that being Cape Spartivento, Gaudo, first Sirte and second Sirte. If you look at the range of these engagements, they opened fire at ranges beyond what was in the Regia Marina's mind the optimal range. You go from a minimum of 24,000 meters to a maximum of 31,000 meters. So distances where it's really hard to hit something, especially a fast-moving target, especially hidden by smoke screens. In the 4th engagement, the second Sirte, the range decreased to distances between 6,000 and 10,000 meters, but the meteo conditions and the visibility were extremely poor. So this cannot be really counted. And I talked about in the Littorio Part 2 video about this specific engagement. So the thing is, the story about the low quality of the propellant charges, it's mostly a post-war mystification, something that was written about by Admiral Iachino in some of his post-war books, and also repeated by other sources, also other admirals that wrote books after the war, but didn't really experience that. And there are works from these people I mentioned here, Colliva, Santarini, and Cernuschi, who were essentially explain why there is no evidence on the fact that the dispersion was associated with the quality of the propellant charges. The main thing is the distance of the engagement, which was high, and as Admiral Santarini described very greatly in his works, is the stabilization of the projectiles. Basically, the Italian projectiles were highly stabilized, and this created the problem that the higher the bigger the distance, the greater the dispersion. But again, if you're shooting at fast-moving targets at 24, 25, 26,000 meters, it's really hard to get something. It must be also said that if you look at the daylight gunnery actions where cruisers and destroyers took place, the Italians really didn't fare that bad in comparison to their British counterparts. So this is certainly a story that must be analyzed in detail, engagement by engagement, and you really see that these cases where the Littorios fired, it was really hard to land a hit on the targets, especially at these distances. That essentially closes the answer to the question. No, maybe I should point out also that the doctrine, the pre-war doctrine of the Regia Marina was to engage the enemy at the highest range possible. In fact, all the guns, all the training were developed in a way to engage the enemy at these distances, because the idea was to hit them hard, straddling them immediately before they could get at the Italian ships, in order to land some hits before and probably create a psychological effect, and also create an initial disadvantage by hitting an enemy from a far distance. You could already change the balance of the engagement, because bear in mind, the Italians were thinking to fight superior enemies, like the French. I mean, the Italians managed to come to a naval parity with the French, but still they were regarded as still a superior navy, and especially the British. So if you are the weaker side, you don't want your valuable ship to be lost. You want to inflict the maximum damage at the earliest as possible, and try to save your valuable ships. So this idea of engaging the enemy from afar, coupled with the ranges where the battleships actually fired, explains more than the myth about the propellant charges. So I hope I explained myself in the best way. Okay, this is an easy one. In what ways did the Italians attempt to cheat the Washington Naval Treaty so that they could build bigger ships, or that they could conduct sea trials before adding all the planned equipment? Yes, this is a thing. I mean, the answer here is very easy. The Italians simply cheated, especially with the Trento and Trieste. They try to respect the treaty, but with the Zara class, they cheated without even trying to conceal this. This is a famous picture of the cruiser Gorizia. This picture was taken in Tangier, and if you see on the bow section, you can see the damage from an internal explosion. The explosion was coming from the fuel tanks of the seaplane embarked on the Gorizia. The tanks exploded and created this these holes in the hull. And the Gorizia went to a shipyard nearby, here in Tangier, and the British managed to have a look at the Gorizia, and by looking at the shapes of the hull, they clearly saw that this ship was beyond 10,000 displacement, beyond the 10,000 ton displacement set by the Washington Naval Treaty. Okay, your recent live on the British Admiralty papers, yes, on the Italian channel, raised an interesting point concerning the Regia Marina aerial reconnaissance described by Cunningham in several letters as excellent and as much superior to ours. Can you outline how this was achieved and the part that it played in the Italian naval doctrine? Okay, so this was an impression that Cunningham had, especially in the early stages of the war. But it was not true. I mean, the Italian aerial reconnaissance at sea was really lacking a decent number of planes and a decent number of modern planes. The bulk of the aircraft were the Kant Z501, quite slow and outdated plane, while the Z506, the one on the left in this picture, was the better one, but one plane that could certainly not rival the characteristics or the performances of the short Sunderlands, for instance. So the Italian Navy has always suffered from the scarce aerial reconnaissance at sea, not because they were ineffective, but because the limited numbers of airplanes in the air or airplanes at their disposal was never enough to deploy a super efficient network of reconnaissance planes. So that's the reason. And this is actually connected to the following question, which is why did the Regia Marina choose to rely on the Air Force instead of having their own land-based air power like the other major navies? What effort did they make to coordinate their actions with the other branches of service? So here, the thing is that the Regia Marina didn't choose to rely on the Air Force. It was forced to rely on the Air Force. Essentially, as I put in this sentence, the Regia Aeronautica, so the Italian Air Force, stripped the Regia Marina of the naval aviation. The Regia Marina had developed a big naval aviation during the Great War, so that at the end of the war, they could field more than 500 seaplanes and a few dozens of airships. And in this number of seaplanes, there were also seaplane fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, and so on. So the thing is that in 1923, an independent air force was established, the Regia Aeronautica, but the Regia Marina kept the naval aviation, confirmed by a decree in 1925. The problems started to arrive the year after, when Italo Balbo became chief of the Regia Aeronautica. So Italo Balbo was one of the leading fascist leaders in Italy. He took part in the march on Rome with Mussolini and the other fascist leader. Actually, Mussolini was not actually there. He was in Milan waiting for them to succeed. Italo Balbo then remained one of the prominent figures of the fascist leadership and became an aviator, and he was famous for the transatlantic voyages with this fleet of seaplanes, the Savoia Marchetti S-55. And then when he became chief of the Italian Air Force, he started to wage a war against the so-called auxiliary air forces, so the aviation component of the Navy and the aviation component of the Army. The thing is, this was a struggle for power. Gaining control of all the aircraft to wage an independent air war in a future war in European soil. This was heavily influenced by the theories of Duilio, and the Regia Aeronautica and Italo Balbo followed this path. The thing is, in 1928, the Regia Marina gave up. It was forced in a way to give up the naval aviation component. They had to abandon the fighters, bombers, their early studies on torpedo bombers, and they could retain only reconnaissance aircraft. Then another blow came in 1931 when Balbo issued this law, where essentially said that all the aircraft belong to the Air Force, and there could be auxiliary air forces for the Navy and for the Army, but these were eventually under the control of the Air Force. The Regia Marina could only assert a certain control of the float on the seaplanes embarked on the cruisers and on the battleships. And then another weakness in the Italian armed forces was the cooperation between the Navy and the Air Force. And I would like to mention one the most relevant episodes, the torpedo bomber issue. So essentially, the Navy had started already to develop the torpedo bombers. The thing is, this came to a halt when they were stripped of their attack capability, and the Regia Aeronautica never really liked in the 1930s the idea of the torpedo bomber. They saw it as an attempt to, in the long run, to give back their the air component to the Navy. They blindly thought that the level bombing was the most efficient way of conducting air operation, also at sea, not only on land. This was, of course, very questionable, but still they stick to this idea. And you see, in many ways, they tried to delay the development and the testing of the torpedoes. They were requesting torpedoes that could be launched from 350 meters, so something very unrealistic. So essentially, they slowed down the development of the torpedo bomber, and then they were forced. Also because the Mussolini came to know that the Germans had acquired around 300 torpedoes, air-launched torpedoes from the Whitehead torpedo factory in Fiume, controlled by Italy. This thing really upset Mussolini, and from them you really see that the Regia Aeronautica finally deciding to establish a torpedo bomber component, which was established, but of course it was never numerous enough to adequately wage war in the Mediterranean. So this is the story put in a very summarized way. This could also be the topic of a future video. The thing is that these are all complicated matters which would require a lot of coverage. Okay, how did the Italian Navy compare to the French Navy prior to World War II? I always get the feeling that the Italian Navy could seriously threaten the Royal Navy forces stationed in the Mediterranean, while the French Navy feels a bit light on fighting power, especially as it also had interests stretching far further than the Med. Okay, this is not true. The fact that the French Navy was light on fighting power, because the French Navy was formidable armed force. It was slightly bigger in terms of overall displacement and number of ships compared to the Regia Marina. The Regia Marina had done a huge effort in reaching this sort of parity. And if prior to World War, if you take, for instance, the numbers prior to World War I, where the French Navy was more than twice the size of the Regia Marina, in 1939, 1940, they came almost on pair. Battleships-wise, at the beginning of the hostilities, the Italians could field, let's say, more battleships, although the Italians had only, in June 1940, they had the two Cavours. And then the other 4, the 2 Duilios and the 2 Littorios, were fitting out, and they will eventually be operational by September, October. The Marine Nationale could field the 2 Dunkirks, and then 3 old, modernized battleships, the Lorraine, Bretagne, and Provence. And then there were the 2 Richelieu in construction, but they were in a less advanced status than the Littorios at the start of the war. On the heavy cruiser component, they were on the same number, 7 versus 7. Light cruisers wise, they were on pair, 12 versus 12, if you count the Pluton. Where the Marine Nationale really had an edge over the Regia Marina was the destroyers. The French Navy had much more destroyers, and especially they had the more large destroyers. I'm talking about destroyers with displacements above 2,300, 2,400 tons. They had more than 30, while the Italians only had the 12 Navigatori, and the rest were smaller compared to the French ships. So on this sector, the French Navy really had an edge. The Regia Marina had more submarines, true, but they were really 2 respectable opponents for each other. And then, yes, the French Navy had the problem that it was dispersed on the Atlantic and then in the Mediterranean. Although they left the British to guard the Atlantic because the German Navy was not a big threat at the start of the war, and then the French could concentrate in the Mediterranean to check the Italians, in addition to the Mediterranean fleet. So connected to the French Navy was the Regia Marina. What was the Regia Marina plan about the French ships that were scuttled in Toulon in 1942? Would it really be a solution in 1943? Because, of course, this refers to the scuttling of the French fleet in November 1942. So this means that most of the work done to salvage some of the ships was done in 1943. So the thing is, most of the French ships were in very bad conditions, and most of them were hard to salvage, or salvaging them made little sense. The thing is, most of these ships could provide valuable steel, valuable materials that could be used by the Italian industry. There are videos from the Propaganda Institute, the Istituto Luce, that shows that the Italians were there cutting the guns, cutting sections of the French ships in Toulon to retrieve the steel and other valuable materials. Actually, and this was true for the battleships, especially because they were in the worst conditions. Actually, the Italians were interested in the light vessels because, as I mentioned at the beginning, with the dragging on of the Battle of the Convoys, the Italians had suffered many losses in terms of destroyers and torpedo boats, and also corvettes like the Gabbianos. They really needed light vessels to escort their convoys. So they were really looking at what light ships, which destroyers or corvettes or sloops they could retrieve. And actually they put their hands on these ships that I listed here. Some of them, only two of them, 2 destroyers were put in service as a fast transports. The FR 22 and 21. Here there is a typo actually. The former Panther and the former Tigre, if I remember correctly, and then also the Trombe, but the Trombe then was stranded. I will show you a picture in a second. Interestingly enough, the Panther was used to carry Mussolini after he was deposed from power, and he was transferred in several secret locations to avoid the Germans to free him, something that they will eventually do. But one of these transfer, Mussolini was embarked on the former Panther. The other ships were essentially refloated and moved to Italian ports where they were supposed to be fitted out, repairs completed, but the armistice got them there, and so the Germans either put them in service in the Kriegsmarine, or they were scuttled, or they never saw service again. Actually, it seems that the Italians plan to put back in service two cruisers, La Galissonière and the Jean de Vienne, because these were the cruisers, as you can see from this picture. It's only listing a bit and is low on the water. The ship has embarked water, but these cruisers were believed to be salvageable, and they could be put back in service in 1944-45. So this was considered, but most importantly, the Italians were looking at the materials to recover. The fuel, it seems that I have to find the exact number, but a few hundreds of tons of fuel were salvaged from the French ships, and of course the light ships that could be used to escort the transports bound to North Africa, or to the traffic that was taking place along the Italian coasts. Most importantly, also the Italians got their hands on a decent size, on a decent share of the French merchant navy, so it could help to maintain the traffic to Tunisia, and also the coastal traffic, or the traffic between mainland Italy and Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica, also because Corsica was occupied by the Italians. Okay, here are some interesting pictures of the destroyers of the French Navy scuttled in Toulon. This is the FR-31, as it was called by the Italians, the former Trom, that actually was refloated, managed to reach Taranto, where it was supposed to embark some equipment, but then due to a navigation error, the ship came aground, and it was recovered later, and then actually it was handed over to the Free French after the armistice with the Allies was signed. Okay, another question. How would you rate the interwar Italian Senior Naval Officer Corps educational system for producing effective naval thought and creating naval planning and strategy compared to their future allies and enemies? So, long story short, this picture shows the Naval Academy of Livorno, which was and still is the training institution for the Italian Navy Officers Corps. The officers, the people that went there, were subject to a very tough education and training. The selection was hard, so the educational system was very good. The officer that took the general staff specialization over other specializations could also benefit from the training of the EGM, which was the Institute for Maritime War. So this provide an additional training and educational experience for developing naval thought orientated to, as in the words of the Admiral Cavagnari, as much orientated to practice as possible. I hope I said it correctly. Anyway, this is something that in the English literature is not covered that much. The first of all, the names of the Italian admirals. You probably have come across the expression that the Italian Navy was good, but their leadership was bad. The Italian admirals were not up to the task, and so on. But notice that often these texts, these books, or the historians that make such claims, they don't give you any names. They don't know any names, because this is probably one of the cliches that has been repeated across the years. But nobody dares to look who were these people, who were the people who developed the Italian naval thought in the 20s and 30s. And the Italian educational system managed to create some very fine naval thinkers like Admiral Fioravanzo and Admiral Bernotti, but we could cite many others that really were, let's say, the peak of the naval thought. And I would like to bring on the channel some dedicated videos about the Italian admirals, the naval thinking, and so on, because this is something very poorly covered in the English-speaking world. And for instance, sorry, I forgot what I wanted to say. The Admiral Bernotti was also the first director of the IGM, the Institute for Maritime War, which produced very fine elements and very fine officers. And one important thing is that the what is that? The Italian Navy kept this magazine, the Rivista Marittima, which was actually founded in the 19th century. This magazine basically was a training ground for the Italian officers that could write about their naval thinking, naval thought in the Rivista Marittima. So it's could be translated to naval maritime magazine, could be the direct translation. So the Rivista Marittima often hosted very fine articles, very fine subjects that were treated by people like Fioravanzo, Bernotti, or Di Gianbernardino, or even Iachino, and many others. Admiral Pugliese, the guy who designed the Littorio class battleships. And they were so interesting that the Rivista Marittima of today, which is still in existence, from time to time they replicate, they republish these articles that were issued by the Rivista Marittima in the 20s or in the 30s. So one thing about a very much overlooked topic. Okay, this is the last one and perhaps the hardest one, because it's a very complicated topic, which certainly deserves an own video. It's the story of the Italian radar. So why didn't the Italians have radar at the beginning of World War II? If they had, what would have been the impact on the war in the Mediterranean? Okay, to start this, remember what I told you at the beginning. Italy was the least of the great power. Italy was still an agrarian country, in the sense that 54% of the workforce at the beginning of the war was still in the agricultural sector. The industry was present, of course, but in many advanced segments like the electronics, radio technique, it was really lagging behind compared to the other major powers. And of course, something like a network of free radio stations like in the US or in Great Britain was not the case in Italy because of the fascist regime, for instance, but also about the economic situation and so on. So Italy was really not the best place where the radar could be developed. Having said that, here is the very summarized story. The first guy in Italy to think about the radar, referred in Italy at the time as radiotelemetro, so could be translated to radio rangefinder, was Marconi, Guglielmo Marconi, so the inventor of the wireless radio. The idea was to demonstrate, and Marconi did this in 1935, to demonstrate that it was possible to measure the distance, try to estimate the distance between the device, the radiotelemetro, and some objects, moving objects at certain distance. He demonstrated that some echoes could be captured by the device, and this could be used for military purposes. The thing is, the armed forces were interested in this idea, and the commission that was put together decided to choose the Navy as the armed force to carry out the work, to carry out the research and development, let's say, because they had the facility, the RIEC, this research institute that was focusing on electronics, radio communication, and stuff like that. And they assigned to this task Professor Ugo Tiberio. Professor Ugo Tiberio was one of the few experts in Italy that understood something about this sector. There were, bear in mind, there were no university courses specialized on radio technique or advanced electronics. There were very few people that could really understand what it was all about. And Tiberio was moved from the army to the Navy, and then he was sent to Livorno, to the RIEC, to start the research on the radar. By 1935, he solved the radar equation, and then he started to work on a few prototypes. The thing is, the prototypes were based on the continuous wave concept and the impulse wave concept. I hope I said it correctly. This last one, the impulse device, was the right one. Let's say what the radar that other scientists in the US or in Great Britain developed. The thing is that based on the intuitions of Marconi, Tiberio started to follow the wrong path, the path of the continuous wave. And then he admitted that after the war, he wasted a few years experimenting this device, what was called the EC1. And then this device was improved into the EC1 bis and the EC2. And then the third prototype, the third device, the EC3, which was one meant to employ the impulse wave concept, was left there. In 1937, an officer, Alfeo Brandimarte, started to work on this prototype. But then Brandimarte remained for a brief period at the RIEC, because there was a very stupid fascist law that stated that officers in the armed forces could only advance in their career, so reaching higher ranks, only if they were married. Brandimarte was single, and apparently he didn't want to get married, and so he decided to leave the Navy and develop his career in the private sector. So Brandimarte left, and Tiberio was left with very few people to aid him, and he had no time and no resources to continue the work on the EC3. The thing is that given the scarcity of experts in these subjects, Tiberio was also forced to teach at the Naval Academy and also work on other radio communication devices that the Navy needed. So again, this tells you that Italy was really in need of these experts for many different reasons, not just because of the radar, and they were never enough. Another issue was retrieving the materials, because the materials to create the valves of the radar, those that allow the device to emit the radiation, were hard to develop in Italy, and for most of the time they had to import stuff from the US, and of course before the start of the war. And sorry. And by the way, by 1939, Tiberio has realized that the work on the EC1 and EC2 doesn't lead him anywhere, and he starts working on the EC3. The EC3 is also plagued by the fact that with the mobilization of the Navy between 1939 and 1940, he is requested to do also other tasks, and this slows down the work. By the end of 1940, the EC3 prototype, actually the EC3 bis prototype, is ready, but needs to be tested extensively. By that time, the war has started. There have been some night encounters between Italian and British warships. But the thing is, if you put them in context, all these night engagements had occurred in decent visibility conditions, so that also the Italian units had managed to sight the British warships and managed to fight them. So there were no clues about the fact that the British had installed some sort of radar on their surface warships. So this didn't sound any alarm. Things changed sharply after Matapan, the disaster of Matapan, where the Italians realized that the British had something to detect the enemy ships at night, where visibility could have impeded any sighting of enemy ships. So this disaster essentially pushed the overall development of the available prototypes. The EC3 bis was installed on the Littorio, but the problem was that it didn't work quite well. You had to train the personnel to use this device, so another problem. You had to install the device on the range finding rotating tower, as you can see it from the picture. So this limited the arc of the search arc of the radar, let's say. So many problems, and most of all, it didn't give any promising results. So the EC3 bis was reworked, and then Tiberio managed to come to the EC3 Ter that was put into production towards the end of 1942. No, in 1942, and then by the end of the year, a few radar sets were developed. Actually, over an order of 50 EC3 Ter. The Italian industry managed to deliver only 13 of them. So this also tells you that the Italian industry was really not up to the task. One thing is to develop the prototype, but another thing is to mass produce these devices. So again, Italy was not industry-wise in the best position to develop the radar. Then in 1942, actually, the German-built devices, the Fumo, were installed on Italian ships. Actually, here on the right, you see the destroyer Legionario, which was the first Italian warship to equip radar set and use it in operational conditions. Later, as you see on the left, the few EC3 TER available, they were also known as GUFO, like the bird, the owl in the owl, sorry, in English. Some of the GUFOs were installed on Italian warships, but it was never a fully satisfactory device. The German equipment was believed to be way better than the GUFO. The thing is, could have made a change, could have changed the outcome of the war. Well, I would say no, because ultimately the war was decided by the industrial and economic strength. But even if Tiberio had developed the EC3 TER before, let's say if he hadn't wasted 2 years working on the EC1 and EC2, still the problem of mass producing these devices was still there to solve. So it would have helped, of course, but you really should have installed these devices on dozens of ships. And if you think that only on a dozen ship was installed by 1943, this really tells you something about the hardship that the Italian industry was facing, especially in building these highly sophisticated devices. So that's pretty much it from my side. I answered all the questions that came through the posts, the Q&A posts. So let me know now if you have some questions that you want me to ask live, to answer live, while I take a sip of water. Otherwise, we will resume to a next episode. Okay, it seems there are no live questions. I remind you that you can like the channel, like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you're interested, you can become a member by checking the links in the description. I remind you to watch the videos, especially the last one, the one about the Axis secret missions to the Far East, employing Italian submarines to transport back to Europe strategic raw materials for the German industry, especially rubber. So I highly recommend you to watch that. If you want me to answer new questions in a future QUARTERDECK episode, please monitor the community on the channel, where I will post the card announcing that I'm going to collect new questions for a new episode. These are the posts that I show. So thank you for the attention, and see you next time on Italian Military Archives.